Number 7. Monster of the Andes. Pedro Alonso Lopez is referred to as the Monster of the Andes for good reason. He's likely the world's worst sex offender and openly admitted to sexually assaulting and killing over 300 young girls throughout the 1970s in Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru. There was a period of 3 years when he hit peak activity for his crimes, murdering at least 2 victims every week. And after he was finally arrested for his horrific actions, he led the police to his personal necropolis, where they uncovered the bodies of 53 girls who were all between the ages of 8 and 12. Pedro was born on October 8, 1948 in the town of Ipiales in Colombia. He had a difficult childhood that was littered with violence and abuse at the hands of his own mother, Benilda, a woman that practiced prostitution and carried out her promiscuous behavior in the same room that her 13 children slept in. The last straw for their mother-son relationship was when Benilda caught Pedro trying to do unspeakable things to her 9-year-old sister. In response to this, she burned his feet with a candle before kicking him out of the house. From then on, Pedro was homeless and the streets of Bogotá became his home. However, at the age of 12, he was adopted by an American couple. Things started to look up for Pedro, that is, until he was sexually abused by one of his school teachers, an event that sent him running back to the streets. After that, crime became his way of life. He started stealing cars and was consequently sentenced to serve 7 years in jail at just 21 years old. In prison, he was heavily abused by the other inmates until one day he decided to take revenge. Pedro retaliated by slitting the throat of his attackers, which is the first time he realized that killing could produce pleasure. Then, after he was released, he traveled to southern Peru, where he started his criminal journey by kidnapping and murdering young girls who lived in the country's Ayacucho region. In Peru alone, he killed around 100 girls, earning him the nickname Monster of the Andes. Then, in 1980, Pedro was arrested in Ecuador after trying to abduct a 12-year-old girl. For his atrocities, he was only sentenced to 16 years in prison, the max penalty for murder in the country at the time. He ended up getting released from a mental institution in 1998, and while nobody knows where he is, he's presumed to be alive today. Number 6. Harold Shipman. Harold Shipman was born in Nottingham, England in 1946, and over the course of his lifetime, he killed over 200 people. He studied to be a doctor and took an oath to refrain from causing harm or hurt, but he was directly responsible for the deaths of hundreds of his patients. Shipman's murders raised concerning questions about the responsibilities and powers of the medical community in Britain and about the competence of procedures for certifying sudden death. Shipman attended Leeds School of Medicine and started working as a physician in the year 1970. Between then and when he was apprehended in 1998, he murdered at least 215 individuals, but it could have been as many as 260, injecting them all with lethal doses of painkillers. Shipman often went by his middle name, Frederick, Fred for short, and growing up, he was the favorite child of his overbearing mother, Vera. She instilled in Shipman a sense of superiority, which tainted many of his relationships later in life, leaving him isolated as an adolescent with very few close friends. He grew up to be a loner, mostly kept to himself, but when he was 19 years old, he met a woman named Primrose, who he would eventually marry. The pair tied the knot when Primrose was only 17. However, she was 5 months pregnant with Shipman's baby. By 1974, he had 2 children and had started working at a medical practice in Todmorden, Yorkshire. This was where he allegedly became addicted to a painkiller called pethidine and began forging prescriptions for huge amounts of the drug. When his medical colleagues found out about his illegal behavior, he was forced to leave the practice in 1975. Afterward, he entered a rehab program and subsequently received a conviction for forgery. A few years later, Shipman accepted a job at Donnybrook Medical Center in Hyde, where he remained on staff for almost 2 decades. After a while, though, the local undertaker began to notice that Dr. Shipman's patients were dying at an unusually high rate. He was concerned enough about this to approach the physician directly about the patterns he was noticing, but Shipman was able to reassure him and put his mind at ease. However, another one of the man's colleagues, Dr. Susan Booth, found a high number of deaths suspicious and contacted the police. An investigation ensued, but surprisingly, Shipman was cleared of any wrongdoings as his records appeared to be in order. But the inquiry failed to check criminal records or contact the General Medical Council, which would have shown evidence of the man's previous record. It was later revealed, though, that Shipman had been altering the medical records of his patients in order to corroborate the causes of their deaths. It's unclear exactly when he started murdering his patients, but his killing spree was brought to an end after the daughter of one of his victims, Angela Woodruff, made it her job to uncover the man's twisted malpractice. Woodruff was a lawyer, and she found out that her mother left the bulk of her estate to Dr. Shipman, which didn't make any sense to her, as she'd always handled her mother's affairs. She became convinced that the physician had murdered her mother for financial gain, and so she alerted the local police. After an autopsy was performed on 81-year-old Kathleen Grundy, it was determined that she passed away from a morphine overdose. As a result, Shipman was arrested and charged with 15 counts of murder on September 7, 1998. He was found guilty of the crimes in January 2000, after which he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Number 5. Maryanne Cotton. In 1852, Maryanne Cotton, a former nurse turned dressmaker from northeastern England, married a man named William Mowbray. Over the next decade, the couple had 8 or 9 children, but the lack of documentation, such as birth and death certificates, makes many details of Maryanne's life open for speculation. After moving several times, the family finally set up roots in Hendon, Durham County in the 1850s, and at some point after this, Mowbray took out a life insurance policy that covered him and the couple's 3 surviving kids. The others had passed away due to gastric fever, which was a common ailment that had symptoms that resembled arsenic poisoning. Unfortunately, this was the same sickness that claimed Mowbray's life in 1864, as well as the lives of 2 of their other children shortly afterward. Maryanne seemed to be cursed, as everyone in her life dropped dead like flies, although things weren't exactly as they seemed, and suspiciously, she left her last surviving child in the care of her mother after collecting the insurance money. She subsequently worked as a nurse in the nearby town of Sunderland, where she married a patient named George Ward in 1865. Mysteriously, though, Ward passed away just a year later, and once again, Maryanne cashed in on another insurance policy. After being widowed twice, she began working as a housekeeper for another widower, James Robinson. Then in 1866, after she'd just arrived at the man's home, one of his 5 kids dropped dead from none other than gastric fever. The next year, Maryanne and her surviving daughter from her marriage with Mowbray moved into Robinson's house. But unfortunately, the girl and 2 of Robinson's children passed away in April 1867. In August of that same year, Maryanne married Robinson, and they went on to have another 2 kids together, but only one survived. Then in 1869, it was found out that she'd been stealing from her new husband, and he began to grow concerned of her repeated requests to take out a life insurance policy on him. She was consequently kicked out and was homeless for a short while. However, Maryanne met Frederick Cotton, another widower and the brother of a family friend, in 1870. That same year, the man's youngest child and his sister passed away. In September, the pair got hitched, even though she was still technically married to Robinson, and later gave birth to a son. Not long after, both Cotton and 2 more children kicked the bucket, and Maryanne was once again awarded a hefty insurance payout. The woman's pattern soon became apparent when another one of her partners died in 1872, but her wicked deeds weren't uncovered until her last stepson with Cotton passed away and an autopsy was performed on his body. His cause of death was determined to be arsenic poisoning. As a result, Maryanne was charged with murdering Cotton. She was found guilty and was sentenced to be hanged due to the other arsenic-related deaths that she was found to be responsible for. Although she never officially confessed to the murders, it's believed that she killed around 21 people. For her horrific crime, she was executed on March 24, 1873. Number 4. BTK Killer. In early 1974, Dennis Rader, a factory worker for the Coleman Company, which is a manufacturer of camping equipment, committed his first murders. He strangled 4 family members to death, including 2 children, in their home in Wichita, Kansas. The mother he murdered worked for the same company he was employed by. After committing the crime, Rader stole a watch from the residence and acquired his own personal souvenir, underwear from his victims. This would become a pattern throughout his 31-year killing spree. After fatally stabbing another woman in April of that same year, Rader wrote a letter describing the January murders in great detail. In the letter he wrote, "The code words for me will be bind them, torture them, kill them, BTK." And after dropping the note in a book at the local library, it was eventually recovered by the authorities, later earning Rader the nickname the BTK Killer. He went on to kill another 5 women over the next 2 decades, killing his 6th victim in March 1977 after locking her 3 children in the bathroom of her home. After murdering another woman in December, he began to grow irritated by the lack of concern by the local police and the lack of media coverage his killings were receiving. So he wrote another letter, this time sending it directly to a local TV station. He wrote, "How many people do I have to kill before I get a name in the paper or some national attention?" The resulting coverage sent the entire community into a panic, possibly worrying Rader that he'd be caught, so he waited a full 8 years before killing again. He killed another 2 women after that, but their cases went cold until 2005, when Rader became sloppy and sent a floppy disk to the police that they traced back to him. He was arrested in February of that year and soon confessed to the murders. He pled guilty to the crimes the next June, and he was consequently sentenced to serve 10 consecutive life terms 2 months later. Number 3. The Maswell Hill Murderer. Dennis Andrew Nielsen, also known as the Maswell Hill Murderer, killed at least 15 people between 1978 and 1983. He was born in Fraserburgh, Scotland in November 1945 and would later make a name for himself as a sick, sexually twisted individual. Nowadays, Nielsen is often referred to as the British Jeffrey Dahmer due to the similarities between their lifestyle, sexuality, and crimes. His first murder took place in late December 1978 after moving to North London and meeting the victim, Stephen Dean Holmes, at a gay bar. Nielsen reportedly strangled Holmes with a necktie until he fell unconscious and then drowned him in a bucket full of water. Unfortunately, Holmes was only 14 at the time, and he'd been on his way home after attending a pop concert. Out of fear of getting caught, Nielsen hid Holmes's body in the floorboards of his home, where they stayed for the next 7.5 months. The next killing happened the following year during a sexual encounter with Kenneth Ockenden, who was later found strangled to death. Strangulation became the main way Nielsen took care of his victims. Over the next 5 years, Nielsen continued to murder unsuspecting gay men, some of whom were prostitutes. However, he made a mistake with his last victim, Stephen Sinclair, who was a known drug addict. After inviting the man back to his place, he strangled him and dismembered his body, boiling Sinclair's hands, feet, and head, placing the rest of him in plastic bags. Some of the victim's organs and flesh were flushed down the toilet, but after a while this caused plumbing issues at his apartment building. A company called Dynarod investigated the problems, as well as the lingering stench that residents were complaining of, and wound up finding pieces of flesh in the pipes leading to Nielsen's residence. He ended up pleading guilty to manslaughter and later confessed to the other murders he'd committed. As a result, he was sentenced to serve life behind bars in November 1983. Number 2. Wana Barazza. Wana Barazza is a Mexican con artist and serial killer who had a tendency to target the elderly. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, Barazza toured Mexico as a masked wrestler called La Dama del Silencio, which translates from Spanish to the Lady of Silence. After giving birth to her 4th child in 1995, she began stealing from stores and later evolved to burglarizing houses. These crimes eventually turned into cold-blooded murder in late 2002 when Barazza killed her first victim, Maria de la Luz Gonzalez Anaya, who was found brutally beaten and strangled to death. Barazza waited another 3 months to kill again, but once she gave in to her sick urges, she could hardly stop herself, and the elderly murders increased sharply afterward. By 2003, it was clear to the local police that they had a serial killer on their hands. After starting a relationship with Jose Francisco Torres Herrera in mid-2005, the two became partners in crime. On September 28, 2005, 82-year-old Carmen Camila Gonzalez Miguel was murdered by the couple, prompting the police to launch a special operation since she was the mother of a prominent Mexican criminologist. However, Barazza gave herself away in January 2006 after a witness saw her leaving a murder scene. She was subsequently identified and arrested by a police officer that just happened to be patrolling the area. She was tried for 30 murders in 2008, but she was only found guilty of 16 of them. Barazza was then sentenced to 759 years behind bars, and she's currently serving her time at the Santa Marta Acatitla prison in Mexico City. And now for number 1. But if you want to hear more bizarre and crazy stories, stay tuned after the video for some more content. Number 1. Robert Lee Yates. Robert Lee Yates committed several murders between 1996 and 1998 in Spokane, Washington. He killed at least 13 women during this time, all of whom were prostitutes that worked the city's Skid Row, which was situated on East Sprague Avenue. Patrick Oliver and Susan Savage were the man's first victims, who just happened to cross paths with him in 1975 as they were picnicking near Walla Walla. Patrick was found with 3 gunshot wounds to the head, while Susan was shot twice. The couple was buried by Yates under a pile of brush, where they were discovered just a few days later. The next murder wouldn't happen for 13 years when Yates targeted his first prostitute, Stacey Elizabeth Horn. Her remains were found 5 months later just outside of Mount Vernon, and she'd been murdered very similarly to the man's first victims. She'd been shot in the head. Over the next 10 years, Yates continued to kill unsuspecting women, typically shooting them before doing unspeakable things to their bodies. He was only caught when a prostitute managed to escape his attempts at murdering her and reported him to the police. Yates ended up getting arrested on his way to work in April 2000 and was subsequently charged with the death of Jennifer Joseph, a victim he'd killed in August 1997. He was found guilty of the crime, but was suspected of murdering another 12 to 18 women. Later that year, he was hit with another 13 counts of first-degree murder, as well as 1 count of attempted first-degree murder. As a result, Yates received a sentence of 408 years in prison. Number 9. Jordan Peterson. In 2018, a New Yorker journalist described Canadian psychologist, author, and media commentator Jordan Peterson as one of the most influential and polarizing public intellectuals in the English-speaking world. The controversial celebrity is particularly praised and hated for his belief that there's an ongoing war on masculinity, as well as his calls to defund feminist studies. Peterson has accused progressive fields of study like anthropology and sociology of being corrupted by postmodern neo-Marxists and believes that they encourage cult-like behavior. He blames universities for creating a culture of political correctness, doubts the validity of climate change, and has even said that the world can benefit from excess carbon dioxide. Peterson's controversial views have earned him a lot of backlash. He's come under heavy fire for his inflammatory social media posts, which have gotten him suspended from Twitter on at least 1 occasion. In 2022, he announced that he would be stepping away from social media after one of his posts criticizing a plus-size Sports Illustrated model was met with widespread disapproval. For all the people who believe Peterson's behavior is harmful, just as many seem to see him as someone who's brave enough to tell it like it is in a soft world. In early 2023, the College of Psychologists of Ontario allegedly threatened to yank his license to practice psychology unless he undergoes mandatory social media retraining at his own expense. Peterson claimed that it would be up to the people in charge of retraining him to determine how long he needed to undergo the program, and that he would be required to admit he'd acted unprofessionally, but not that he committed any wrongdoings. In a piece written for the National Interest, Peterson made it clear that he adamantly refuses to attend the retraining sessions. He challenged the regulatory body in court by requesting a judicial review of the case. If the court orders him to complete the social media training in order to keep his license, he's vowed to publicly share all the details of what goes on during the sessions. The outcome of the case remains to be seen. Number 8. Seattle Police versus School Officials. The day was almost over for students at a Seattle school in June of 2022 when an intruder hopped a fence onto the campus and entered the building. Terrified kids ran for safety as the man walked through the school, entering at least one classroom and stealing a child's backpack. An adult reportedly had to intervene to keep him away from 2 students. According to a police report, school officials never dialed 911 during the lockdown. Someone else did, and when officers responded to the scene, staff members were allegedly uncooperative. Officer Nicholas Gusley Jr. told local station KIRO7 that the principal and 2 teachers refused to talk to the police, so he treated the call as a welfare check. He said that the suspect, later identified as 20-year-old Libin Harsam, appeared to be under the influence of narcotics or having a mental episode. In the report, Gusley wrote that the principal refused to identify the student whose backpack was stolen, which meant that there was technically no victim in the case and therefore no probable cause to search the suspect. King County spokesperson Casey McNairthney said that there would be no felony charges against Gusley due to the investigators' inability to gather enough evidence to justify a case. Harsam was initially charged with criminal trespass, vehicle prowling, 2 counts of assault, and resisting arrest, which are all minor violation-level charges. Prior to the incident, he'd been charged at least 9 times in other cases that year alone. A few days after the school intrusion, authorities announced that additional investigative work had turned up enough evidence to slap some felonies onto the list of charges Harsam faces. He's also now being accused of assaulting a delivery person and a police officer after he left the school. District officials remain tight-lipped about why they didn't cooperate with the police, but their refusal to do so hasn't made them look good, especially as the case continues to make headlines. Number 7. Slobodan Praljak. Numerous wars broke out during the breakup of Yugoslavia in the early 1990s as 4 of its former republics declared their independence. At the same time, various ethnic groups, namely Serbs living outside Serbia and Croats living outside Croatia, fought for their place within newly defined borders. Horrifying atrocities were committed during these conflicts, and when the fighting was finally over, a United Nations War Tribunal sought to bring war criminals to justice. In 2004, former Bosnian Croat General Slobodan Praljak and 5 other ex-military members were indicted for alleged crimes against humanity during a conflict called the Croat-Bosniak War. Praljak was accused of ordering the destruction of a 16th-century bridge in the city of Mostar, where some of the war's worst fighting occurred. By destroying the bridge, he allegedly caused disproportionate damage to the Muslim civilian population. The former military leader maintained his innocence throughout the trial, claiming that the bridge was a legitimate military target, but in the end, he was convicted of a laundry list of crimes, including willful killing, unlawful deportation, cruel treatment, unlawful labor, plundering, unlawfully attacking civilians, persecution on political, racial, and religious grounds, and more. Praljak received a 20-year prison sentence but successfully appealed his case. He'd already served 13 years when he was granted a new trial in 2017. And while some of his convictions were overturned, his original sentence was upheld. This outcome was unacceptable to the senile defendant, who said, "Judges, Slobodan Praljak is not a war criminal. With disdain, I reject your verdict." Then he pulled out a bottle of cyanide and drank it, and you can likely guess what happened next. It's unclear whether Praljak knew that he would have been eligible for release from prison soon, having served more than 2/3 of his sentence. Sadly, the act was more likely done in defiance of the ruling against him than out of any mental anguish he may have felt about the thought of remaining in prison. Journalist Harry de Quetteville famously pointed toward the act as the most dramatic proof possible of the denial that many people remain in over the ethnic cleansing that went on during the 90s. Number 6. H.B.T. Chadwick. In 1995, Philadelphia lawyer H.B.T. Chadwick was entangled in bitter divorce proceedings with his soon-to-be ex-wife Bobby when the judge overseeing the case suspected him of lying about losing his nearly $3 million fortune to avoid hefty alimony payments. Chadwick insisted he spent the money on bad investments, but the court ultimately ordered him to produce it. When he refused, he was sent to jail for contempt of court. He remained behind bars for 14 years. In 2009, Delaware County Judge Joseph Cronin finally freed Chadwick, concluding that his incarceration had failed to have a coercive effect and that he was unlikely to turn over any money he might be hiding. It was the longest imprisonment on a contempt charge in United States history. Despite granting the stubborn attorney his freedom, Judge Cronin agreed with previous rulings that Chadwick was capable of complying with the court order to produce his money, and that he simply chose not to. Bobby described her ex-husband as extremely controlling. She told ABC News shortly after his release that she received a meager $600 monthly allowance and was stretched so thin financially that she sewed her own clothing, despite being married to a millionaire. When Chadwick imposed a toilet paper limit of 6 sheets per bathroom visit, Bobby reached her breaking point with his irrationally frugal ways. So she packed her belongings into garbage bags and left after 15 years of marriage. Bobby's lawyers allegedly tracked a lot of the missing money to a bank in Gibraltar. Its path back to the US was also traceable, but Chadwick continued to deny that it existed. By the time he was released, Bobby had given up on ever receiving a divorce settlement and was making a modest but comfortable living as an artist. Number 5. Tuberculosis patient refuses to isolate. In early 2023, the Tacoma-Pierce County Health Department in Washington state revealed that it was monitoring an active case of tuberculosis, but that the woman suffering from the illness was refusing treatment. At the time, the department said it was isolating the patient in order to prevent the disease from spreading, and that they were trying to persuade them to cooperate with taking medication. In a statement, spokesperson Nigel Turner said that most people are happy to get the treatment they need, but that there are legal measures the department can take in rare cases where patients refuse help. And that's exactly what happened in this case. It was the 4th time in 20 years that the agency sought court intervention. In 2015, a tuberculosis patient was put on an electronic monitoring device to ensure they stayed home throughout a 9-month course of treatment. The first request for a court order in the current case was made in early 2022, after the patient persistently refused treatment and allegedly kept leaving her house despite orders to isolate. More than a year and several court orders later, officials are still trying to get her to cooperate. Most recently, a judge gave the health department the green light to have the woman arrested and taken to jail for up to 45 days for isolation. According to the last update, the agency was still hoping to obtain compliance. However, it's unclear whether the patient was taken to jail or not. Number 4. Elena Stern. Most Americans despise going to the notoriously slow and unfriendly Department of Vehicles, but most of us understand that we have to be patient and follow their rules if we want service. It's unclear what set off an argument between DMV employees in Deerfield Beach, Florida, and a 31-year-old woman named Elena Stern in 2015, but it didn't end well. Staff members called the police and asked them to remove Stern from the building after the disagreement reportedly got out of hand. A Florida state trooper responded to the scene and initially tried to take a peaceful approach with the disgruntled woman, but she was clearly in no mood for civilized conversation. In footage of the attack, the suspect can be heard berating the cop for not being able to fight. The trooper remained calm, but ended up throwing Stern onto the floor to get her under control. Even after he covered the suspect with his body in an attempt to subdue her, she remained combative. Stern managed to wiggle out from beneath the trooper, but he quickly caught up with her and finally got her out the door. She was charged with 1 count of resisting arrest without violence. Number 3. Michael and Alexandra Nelson. What started out as a routine traffic stop in Long Island, New York one night in December 2018 quickly devolved into uncivilized chaos after state troopers began to suspect the driver of being intoxicated. According to an arrest report, 38-year-old Michael Nelson was visibly under the influence of alcohol. He was accused of repeatedly headbutting officers, while his wife, 29-year-old Alexandra, attempted to obstruct his arrest. The pair were taken down to the local barracks, where authorities claimed they continued to act combative. Police Lieutenant Victor Gazul told News 12 that Andrea spat at troopers and threw objects, including a pair of urine-soaked underwear, while Michael refused chemical tests. Michael was charged with driving while intoxicated, second-degree assault, criminal possession of a controlled substance, resisting arrest, and harassment. Andrea was hit with charges for second-degree attempted assault, criminal possession of a controlled substance, obstructing governmental administration, and disorderly conduct. The couple's lawyer, Mark Gann, told the press that the charges were quite overblown and that there was more to the story, but he declined to elaborate any further on the matter. Unfortunately, the outcome of the case is unclear. Number 2. Impatient judge versus defiant defense attorney. A Brevard County, Florida courtroom erupted into chaos one day in 2014 when Judge John Murphy lost his patience with a defense lawyer's refusal to waive his client's right to a speedy trial. Footage of the heated interaction showed Murphy repeatedly ordering Assistant Public Defender Andrew Weinstock to sit down. Weinstock refused to sit and said that he had a right to stand and defend his client, at which point Murphy challenged Weinstock to go out back and settle things the old-fashioned way. The men then disappeared off camera after walking into a hallway. People in the courtroom could hear banging and cursing before the judge returned to the courtroom out of breath. Weinstock's colleague, public defender Blaze Tretis, told Florida Today that Judge Murphy grabbed the lawyer by the collar and started punching him in the head as soon as he entered the hallway. Luckily, though, the two men were separated by a bailiff. And while Murphy received a round of applause upon his return to the courtroom, not everyone was impressed by his conduct. A few days after the incident, he took a temporary leave of absence to seek anger management treatment and was ultimately removed from the bench. Number 1. Penelope Soto. After being arrested in Miami for possession of Xanax in 2013, 18-year-old Penelope Soto giggled and behaved disrespectfully during a bail hearing in front of Judge Jorge Rodriguez Shoma. The judge initially set the young woman's bond at $5,000, but when she dismissively waved and said adios, Rodriguez Shoma apparently wasn't a fan of the girl's attitude though, so he increased Soto's bail to $10,000. Soto responded by giving him the middle finger and telling him to F off, earning her 30 days in jail for contempt of court. Soto appeared in front of the judge just days later and apologized for her irrational behavior. Luckily, Rodriguez Shoma was forgiving. He vacated the teen's contempt sentence and lowered her bail back down to $5,000, and he even offered Soto an agreement that would see her charges dropped if she completed a rehab program. A year later, Soto made good on her end of the deal. After passing more than 100 drug tests as part of what she described as a life-changing program, the case against her was dismissed. What would you do if you found out your elderly next-door neighbor was a serial killer in their younger years? Let us know in the comments below. If you enjoyed today's video, be sure to subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. Bye.